Join me in welcoming George Hill.
It's good to be with you guys. It's just familiar faces. I feel like I'm like at a family reunion. So I just love hanging out with ASSE. In fact, this morning it was interesting. I used to be on the executive board and for the chapter, and so our meeting started at 10:30. So I just showed up at 10:30 and thought I was ready to roll. And then they reminded me. Dave said, "Do you know you're not supposed to be presenting till noon?" And I said, "Well, okay." And then just to tell you, it's been kind of a whirlwind. I was in Orlando, Florida last week. I was in Spokane, Washington up until last night. And then I got in this morning to work. And so I hope that when I talk to you today that I'm not talking about things that don't have to do with fit for duty. But today, the topic of discussion, or what I've been asked to speak on, is fitness for duty as an overall general topic, but also how do you mitigate risk and also keep your employees safe in the workplace, and how does that reflect back to whether or not you're in HR, as an HR component of keeping people healthy and safe, or if it's as a safety professional in the workplace. I put these slides up just because my dad used to always say, if you can't do anything informative, at least make them laugh. And I thought these were three funny slides that may be related. The first one, I mean, it kind of speaks for itself. I don't know if these are related to fit for duty. The second one, if you can read it, says early experiments in transportation. I don't know if that guy's fit for duty. And then the other one I thought was funny says, for some reason, Gary Larson, if you recognize him as the cartoonist, it says, he always did things with scientists and rockets. It says, it's time we face reality, my friends. We're not exactly rocket scientists. So we won't be talking about any of those professions today, but I did want to talk to you about fit for duty. With any kind of a presentation, what I like to do is also set the expectation for myself. You all came here for a reason. I don't think it was strictly just to get a nice dinner or lunch, but hopefully to learn something. What I want to make sure is that you walk away from here having learned something today, some sort of nugget that you can take with you and maybe apply in what you're going to go back and do at work. So what are your expectations coming in? Is there anything that you were hoping to get out of today, or questions that you want to address that by the end of the presentation we make sure to answer? And I'll just put that out to the group. And everyone but Dennis can answer that question. Anything in particular you want to make sure we address?
Fit for duty requirements when you actually do employment seeking itself, and you're looking for applicants, screening, making sure that you're doing so.
So you're talking about like pre-hire screening. Okay, we'll talk about that. There's kind of an interesting thought around, let me make sure I write that down, pre-hire. Today, especially, I think, in fact, I got an email this morning that there's a unique difference between pre-placement functional screening, is what we identify it as, and fitness for duty, which is usually, oftentimes occurs after you've been hired. So I'll kind of differentiate those and how we see that breaking down. Yeah, Rocco.
Liability concerns when it comes to ordering somebody for a fitness for duty.
So
what threshold do you need to cross?
Okay, like what does the law say?
Yeah.
Okay, we'll talk a little bit about that. Okay, good. Anything else? Yes?
I think you're interesting to talk about the line between what's appropriate in a fit for duty and what would maybe be like discrimination.
Okay.
What are the things you have to be careful of?
Okay. Perfect. Okay, anything else? Okay, let's, oh yeah, Pam.
A little bit of term that keeps getting thrown around is physical capacities.
Yeah.
Which is different than functional. If
Yeah.
you don't mind kind of differentiating.
Okay,
Thank you.
you bet. Okay, well let's jump in. If there's anything else that comes up or anything that kind of comes to mind while we're talking about certain things, please be involved and ask the questions. What I kind of set for my own expectations, and I want to be able to walk away from here saying that I've helped you understand what is a fit for duty. Outlined a little bit about what the responsibilities of the employer are in the process. What is the responsibilities of the safety professional, but also what's the responsibilities of human resources? And we know this really well in safety, is that human resources and safety have to really be linked when you're talking about how you care for the employee. I really want to drive home the idea that a fit for duty is going to never be successful unless you have clearly outlined and very well defined physical job requirements for the job you're evaluating. What determines fit for duty will do that. And then I thought what would be helpful is just to go through some case scenarios, some of the ones that recently that I've had in our practice, and what those scenarios kind of look like, and then what the outcomes were. Because oftentimes, unfortunately, what we sometimes see in fit for duty is people use it as a punitive thing to try and get rid of somebody. If your mentality, or if your expectation is that you're, as an employer, trying to do a fit for duty to get rid of someone, then you're probably addressing it the wrong way. It's not the way that you want to go about it. But we'll talk a little bit about that in the case studies. So first of all, if you look at the notes I provided, we want to consider some of the ADA accommodation considerations. And this goes into kind of what you were talking about with liability, Rocco. The ADA accommodation world is so gray and has so much variability that oftentimes there's no right or wrong answer. It really boils down to situational based decision making that you make on how you accommodate someone. In ADA considerations, under the ADA, you can require someone prior to hire to complete a fit for duty evaluation, which we identify as a pre-employment functional screen. And also, in the event that someone is working and there's an observable restriction in their ability to perform all of the essential functions, you can also, under the law, perform, and under ADA guidelines, perform a fitness for duty. Someone cannot come to you and say, well, if you came to them as an employee and said, we'd like to evaluate whether or not you can do this job, they can say, well, under ADA, you can't ask me to do that. You can ask to perform a fit for duty. You just have to make sure that in that process, you're following the rules, the regulations that are outlined in how you define what your fit for duty is, and then how you march through that process. So today we'll talk a little bit about that. ADA considerations also is it has to be job related. When you're considering whether or not someone's able to perform the essential functions of their job, it has to be related to the work that they do and specific to the work that they do. And then the other thing is oftentimes with fit for duty, you're not checking a box of able to work or not able to work. You're literally checking a box that then you can say, are we able to accommodate this under the ADA guidelines, or are we not able to accommodate this person under ADA guidelines? Does that make sense? We could probably spend the entire class talking about ADA issues around fitness for duty. I wanted to talk a little bit about the difference between these three. Does anyone know the difference between this? Impaired, disabled, and handicapped. So you hear those words, and that's a lot of times what you're going to associate fitness for duty with, is someone's inability to perform the essential functions of their job. Is it because they are impaired? Is it because they are disabled? Or is it because they have an identified handicap? So in order to know the answer to that question, I think it's good to know the difference in these definitions. So first and foremost, impaired. Impaired is a loss of a loss or abnormality. It could be in three different realms: psychological, physiological, or in anatomical structure. So if you have a loss or abnormality, what would be an example of that? Who can give me an example? Just a physical example. Okay, blind? Well, we'll talk a little bit about that. Okay, so one that stands out to me that's really simple, an impairment, is that for a period of time you're on a certain amount of medication that keeps you from being able to fully perform a function, right? What's an example of that? pain medications, or even more basic. Over the weekend, I really enjoyed hanging out with my friends that are in a medical marijuana farm out in wherever it's called. And I came into work on Monday and I was slightly impaired. Right? And impairment is something that may not be forever. It may be for a period of time. That's kind of the way I look at it. It's boxed into a period of time.
Could it be related to maybe muscle soreness after?
I went snowmobiling for the entire weekend. I guess you could stretch it that way if you wanted to as an impairment, but if it works for Dennis, then it works for everyone. The difference where you see is that the actual identifier is disabled then means that because you were impaired, you have a disability. Does that make sense? Okay. So because I was impaired, I wasn't able, or I had a restriction in my ability. Can that be a permanent restriction? It can be a temporary restriction, or it can be a permanent restriction. And then finally, handicapped then goes into kind of what you're describing is it's more permanent. It's going to be that I had a disadvantage to myself or my body or my mind that limited me in my function. And that could be across the board. Again, falling into those categories of psychological, physiological, or anatomical. The reason I bring that up and talk about that when we're looking at fit for duty is the people that are going to present for a fit for duty evaluation are going to fall into one of these categories. They're going to have either an impairment, a disability, or a handicap in some respect that you're going to have to address. And then we talked about this, the different types of fit for duties that we see, that we start to apply this to, can boil down to the 4 types. Drug and alcohol impairment. Someone comes into work and you've all been through your reasonable suspicion class. You reasonably suspect that the person is impaired in some way, and you need to have them evaluated. One of the things we do in our own facilities for our own employees is that we have a policy and a procedure that looks at a person's fitness for duty, and if they're impaired and there's a suspect of drug or alcohol reasoning behind it, then we do a mini mental exam, and then they see a provider to do a drug screen or a breath alcohol test. That would be a form of a fit for duty. The next one would be a medical. Someone presents in the workplace and they have a restriction or an impairment, and that impairment is deemed to be something medical. Either they've presented to you or they've come to you and said, hey, I need to talk to you about it. Last week I was diagnosed with such and such, and it's going to have me on this certain medication, and it's going to cause me to have this kind of an impairment at work. Well, if they're a forklift driver and it's an opioid, is that possible? That would then trigger the idea that we need to perform and identify if there's a need for a fit for duty. It could be psychological, especially if we think about what's going on in the world today. One of the behavioral kind of characteristics that we can see is someone might be completely physically capable to do anything, but psychologically there might be a limitation, something that's keeping them from being able to fully address all the essential requirements of their job. And then the one that probably we deal with the most is your physical functional. Is there a physical limitation that keeps you from being able to do all the elements of your job? And we'll get into kind of what those can sometimes be with the case scenarios. So those are the different types of fit for duties that we see. Any questions on that? If I was to say to you right now in your workplaces, is there somebody, please don't tell me who it is, but if you thought about it long enough, is there somebody that maybe it would fall into a category where it would be maybe an opportunity for you to really evaluate whether that person can do the essential functions of their job? I would say probably more or less in all of our workplaces there is. Does it rise to the level of evaluation? No, but at least I would say in most cases you're going to find, oh, you don't have to pay for this. You're paying for the presentation? Oh, okay. Well, you just pass that off. Okay. So what is the responsibilities of the employer? First and foremost, you need to know and understand the law. What can you do and what can't you do? What can you ask for and what can't you ask for? And knowing and understanding the law really boils down to, with fit for duties, knowing and understanding the basics of the ADA, knowing when you can ask a person to perform something. So let me just ask the question, when could you ask someone to perform an evaluation of whether or not they could do the essential functions of the job? Can you do it in the job interview? You can ask the question, but you can't evaluate them until they've what? Accepted the position. So you can ask the question, but in the world that we're talking about with pre-hire fit for duty, we consider that, or we call that, a pre-placement functional screen. It means that they are hired contingent upon passing a certain amount of evaluations. That could be a drug screen, breath alcohol test. Usually people don't do breath alcohol tests for pre-employment though. It could mean a physical that says that they're physically capable of the job. And it could mean a functional test where they have to demonstrate their ability. So their contingency upon continuing in the job after you've hired them is to complete all those evaluations. But before they get hired, you cannot ask someone to do something. The next thing I would say is know the job. You need to, as safety professionals, understand the job that you're asking them to do. In HR, you need to understand the job that you're asking them to do. Not only is that in a descriptive job description that's detailed enough that you can understand all the elements of the job, but you also have to be able to identify what are the physical job requirements that are required for that position. Now, what I can tell you is, oftentimes what we see, I'll see something that says, person must lift, carry, push, pull, climb, stoop, bend, crawl 50% of the day. Person also must be able to lift up to 100 pounds. And person must be able to have endurance, good vision, and be able to communicate effectively. Right? Well, I think everyone needs to be able to do that. But if you have that sort of a job description and that's the tail of if that's all that you have for them to go off of, anyone can agree that they can do that. And is it descriptive enough? Oftentimes no, to be able to determine whether or not that they're really truly capable. So detail in your job, knowing what the job is. Employer responsibilities, when we start to talk about a fit for duty, a fit for duty that I'm going to talk about from now through the rest of our conversation has to do with your already hired employee. Okay? So if we wanted to do another presentation in the springtime or something like that, Dave, on pre-hire capacity testing or something like that, we could talk about that. But I want to focus now on fitness for duty once the person's hired. So let's create the scenario. Joe works out in the yard and he parks his car at the front of the parking lot, and then he has to walk to his destination. Let's say that Hal's in his office and he notices that as Joe makes his way across the parking lot, he leans up against 2 or 3 cars and takes a quick break, kind of catches his breath. And what should take him 2 minutes to get across the parking lot from where he parked his car to where he was going to end up to do his work takes him 20. What's my responsibility then as the safety professional and also as the human resources person in addressing that observed, what would be your observation? What would be the responsibility of the employer in that case? Okay, so first I have to identify what's going on, right? Maybe it's a phone call in, or it's asking him, hey, Joe, after work today, can you maybe swing by my office? I wanted to have a follow-up discussion with you. Pulls into the office, and it's a simple question. Hey, how you doing? You know, one of the things that we notice is more often than not, an employee is more than willing to talk about how they are doing, if you just ask. Partly because you can't hide it. Joe's not going to hide this. He's now at a place in his physical health where it's it's bold enough of or different enough from what is considered normal that it's hard to hide. So communicating effectively to say, well, Joe, you know what, maybe what we ought to do is we ought to look at what are some of the things we can do to accommodate you. If you're having a hard time, what are some of the things you're having a hard time with? And he says, well, you know what, I'm not having a hard time with anything. I just would like to be able to park closer. Can I park close to my work? What's the first thing an employer is going to say? Sure. Yeah, let's get you parked closer. But then you'll go back in your little book and write up and say, I better keep my eye on Joe and see if there's anything else. Or maybe I'll go to his supervisor and communicate with his supervisor and find out, hey, what's been going on, or have you kept an eye on Joe? Or I'm going to talk to the safety consultant and say, hey, on your rounds, could you spend a little time and kind of watch Joe and how he works? Okay. If Joe all of a sudden starts demonstrating other restrictions, like he takes longer breaks than everybody else, maybe he's not doing his work at the same pace as everyone else. Everyone else gets 15 widgets done in an hour and Joe gets 5. All of a sudden, that starts to become your foundation for how you're going to communicate back to that employee. And those are the critical conversations that you need to have that will then be able to address what's next on the list, and that is, how do I address this from a factual standpoint of Joe not meeting the essential functions of his job? So that next conversation becomes what? Hey, Joe, I want to sit down and talk to you about the job description real quick. One of the things I've noticed is that you've been having difficulty with this, and this. Here we have the job description. There's some pieces of the job that you're not able to do right now. When you're working with people and they've acknowledged that they have a restriction that you haven't identified yet, they're more than willing to tell you what they can't do and what they can do. Now, do you want to create an adversarial relationship with the employee, or do you want to create a supportive relationship with the employee? If you're creating the supportive relationship, the next question then becomes in your effective communication is, Joe, what if we were to do something to see if we can identify what it is that you're having difficulty with and what we maybe need to do about it? So having an up-to-date and accurate job description with physical requirements is going to be key to what you're going to communicate then back to the professionals like us about what is it that I need to do, or what is it that we need to evaluate about this person. Okay? Well, his job is this, and the expectation is he has to do this, and this. And then the physical requirements for that are this, and this. If I have that information, that's an easy walk in the park for me to bring Joe in, to sit down with him, and then I can start doing my evaluation of what he's able to do and what he's not able to do. If I don't have a physical job requirements evaluation that has the physical job tasks outlined specific, I'm starting at a loss, because then I have to start making assumptions, and then guess who's going to fill in the gap? Joe. And what's Joe's problem? He's been accommodating the job for 5 years, so he's going to tell me different, and maybe it's different than the expectation that you as the employer have for him. So knowing that there's something that I can go off of is a foundation. Other responsibility for the employer is just being willing to accommodate. Whenever you go into these situations, if you want to go into them with an adversarial relationship, you're going to find that more often than not it will end in 2 things. One, the person will either leave disgruntled, and I don't know that anyone wants an employee leaving disgruntled from the employer. Or 2, they're going to challenge everything that you've done. And they're going to get a lawyer, and then that lawyer is going to tell you all the things that you didn't do right. And they're going to pinpoint everything. The reason I say that is because that's oftentimes when we do get involved is after the legal team will contact us and say, did they ask you to do this? So if you can get the information that you need and be prepared to accommodate, there are definite lines that you can fall into about how you can still meet that employee's need. And then there's also very definitive lines where you can say, you are not physically capable to perform the essential functions of this job, and we're going to either reassign you, or there's no longer a position here. Why don't we talk about what are your other options? It can also lead into a conversation about disability. And that's something for HR folks where everyone starts to get a little excited when you talk about disability, but it at least gives you a doorway of a way that you can take the conversation. And then also the employer's responsibilities. What do you do with the results? When we do a fitness for duty evaluation, we are not going to tell you whether you should keep the employee or fire them. That's not our responsibility. What we do is we outline what they're physically capable of doing. We describe it in detail how it relates back to the essential functions of the job. And then more importantly, we also give recommendations about what you can or should do as it relates to the next step for the employee. So we will send those results to you, and then we leave it up to the employer to make the decision. We're not going to make it for you. Sometimes what we do is we get someone that says, I've got this guy that's been working here for a long time, and we're trying to figure out whether or not we can fire him. Can you tell us whether or not we can fire him? We're not going to tell you whether or not to fire somebody. But definitely we want to know what to do with the results. Any questions on that? Is this hitting the mark? Is it kind of helping? No one's glossed over yet, so.
What about like situations where you have someone that has gone out for some kind of personal illness, and they come back with a note from their doctor that's got some kind of limitations outlined? Can you as an employer still send them to someone like you and say, this is the job description? Can you give us recommendations based on the job description?
Yeah, a lot of that's going to be determined by your policy, and so this is maybe one area that I didn't talk about, but you always want to make sure that HR has a policy on how you manage people who are coming back to work for a non-work related injury. So there's two different categories. A work-related injury, you have to go down what road? You have to provide light duty. You want to keep them working as long as you can. You want to accommodate them in the workplace till you can get a full release from the doctor. If it's a non-work related injury, you can do two things. We see this less and less because it's being challenged in the courts more often than not. But you can say, until you have a full work release from your from your provider, we do not have a place for you to come back and do your job. That's getting challenged a lot more in the courts, but it's something that if your policy says that until you have a full release, but what do we know in this day and age that a doctor's going to do? Hey doc, I need to get back to work. All my time off has run out. I'm on my last week. I'm feeling great. Well, what is it that you do for work? Well, I load wood onto the back of trucks, and then this doc says, well, can you do it? And he says, yeah, I just use a forklift, so it's no problem. The doc signs off on it. Is loading wood onto the back of trucks a little more than just driving a forklift? Are the physical requirements maybe a little more than maybe what he would report? Yeah. So you want to really be aware of what the policy and procedure is for the company that you work for. And then also you want to be aware of, if you do get a doctor's note, you want to be able to have the doctor sign off, not on that the person can come back to work, but you would send the doctor a note that said, these are the physical requirements that are expected of him. Can he perform all these physical requirements? If the doctor signs off on it and the guy shows up for his first day of work and you're like, wait a second, that's when it would trigger you to say, well, we want to seek outside medical advice about whether or not this person is fit for duty, and then that's when you would request the fitness for duty. And under the law, that's something that you can do. So, does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think the other one's kind of buried in there is, when someone's hurt at work, they can choose the provider they go to seek treatment, where this is kind of a follow-up check, or we providing you guys with a list of these are the requirements.
Yeah. So you're talking about two completely different things. So you're talking, again, if we're running down we'll say this table is a workers' comp table, and this table is the fit for duty table. So on workers' comp, yeah, in the state of Oregon, you can choose whatever provider that you want to go to get the feedback.
So this would be completely separate.
If it's I got injured in a snowmobile accident with Dennis Jordan on the weekend, and I'm trying to figure out what I need to do to get back to work on Monday, that's something where you get to call the shots that says, at our company, we have established that before you return to work, you have to have a note from your doctor that gives you a full medical release, and you will or may have to go through a fitness for duty. Now, we do two types of fitness for duty for return to works. You can do the extensive fit for duty, which is very detailed, and it oversees all the physical requirements. Or you can do a return to work fit for duty that says you have to meet this baseline of requirements in order to come back. Most companies that do that second option do it because they have a pre-established functional test that they do when a person gets hired on. So it's an already established test, and they're just running them through and checking off the box to say they've been able to do that. Southern Oregon Head Start does that. Mercy Flights is another company that does that. So I hope that kind of answers your question. Okay, so what happens in a fit for duty? Okay, the employer identifies that the person has limitations, whether it's that they're new to the job or that they are returning from an injury that was not work-related. If that's the case, then the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to collect the records, and we're going to do a medical records review of what that person's limitations are, what their restrictions are, what they may have as an underlying medical condition. When we look at the underlying medical condition, we're determining whether or not that person is qualified just based on paper to come in to do an evaluation. If I do a records review and that person's got extraordinarily high blood pressure, is diabetic, and they're going to have to qualify for a DOT job where they have to drive a truck. Well, I already know I don't even need to bring them in based upon their records review, and I may request them to go back to their primary care doctor and get additional information or provide us an update on their medical condition. But once we do that records review, yes.
So let's just say as an employer, I want John Doe to be evaluated by you guys for fit for duty.
Uh-huh.
What do we do in the interim? While you guys are looking at the records? Do we pay them on administrative leave? Do we have them work? What's?
This is my favorite question. You follow the policy and procedure of your company. So what are some of the options? Some people will put them on paid administrative leave. Some people will not pay them and put them on administrative leave. Some people will find a job for them that's not the job that they are qualified. They might bring them in and have them do stapling at the desk. You know, really, that's up to whatever your policy and procedure is for your individual company, and it's across the board. I've yet to see a company that doesn't do all of those different options. Where you want to be careful, where I would say probably is if you're doing the drug or alcohol fit for duty, and you're waiting for the testing to come back. You're always better off to have them on either a paid or a non-paid administrative leave while you're pending the results. An example I can use, we just had someone that came in that was a DOT driver. He knew he was dirty before he went into the test. So he went to someone in his office and said, I'm not going to pass this one. That person then said that to the supervisor, but guess what? Their policy is until the person's result comes back, they can continue to work. Guess what? The results go out. I don't know if you guys know this with drug and alcohol testing. If the results come in, if you come in on a Friday, and people will do this, they'll plan it on a Friday at 4 o'clock, and then they'll hold us over for 3 hours, because you can do under DOT a wait for 3 hours. They'll test right before they have to leave, thinking that we'll give in and just let them leave, and they'll test on Monday. Hope that marijuana gets out of their system by then. And then we can't process that test till when? Monday. Then it processes, has to travel to the lab for further testing. That's Tuesday. It gets processed in the lab on Tuesday, which means they don't get the result until Wednesday. If the Wednesday lab comes back and says needs to be quantified, meaning that they have to now tell you how much was in, it has to be retested, that's Thursday. And then here we get Friday, the result comes in. A week has gone by and that person could be out still driving. So you want to pay attention to what your policy and procedure is for what to do when someone's been requested for a fit for duty. That would be... Okay, so we do a records review. With any fit for duty, you also start out with the baseline. A fit for duty determination is always determined by a doctor. So the medical doctor has to evaluate the person, so it starts with a scheduled physical. Okay? In the physical, based upon their medical background and based on their present explanation and then a medical evaluation of physical, the doctor's going to determine whether or not that they have sufficient information to identify what that person's limitations are. If the doc has sufficient information, then he could just identify this person's not fit for duty and these are their restrictions. And then they can lay those restrictions out. Those restrictions could be laid out in detail where it says person is able to do this but is not able to do this. Or it could be that it's said more generally, like person unable to lift above 50 pounds. You know, we're not going to tell you why. We're not going to describe for you what their medical condition is. And you actually don't want to know that information. But the medical information can then not provide sufficient enough information for us to determine whether or not they're fit for duty. We need to do more. That's where maybe something like a psychological evaluation comes in. If the person not only is having physical limitations, but there's also either psychological limitations or a behavioral disorder that's starting to present itself, the provider will put them on what's called medical hold, and you'll see that. We'll report back to the employer, this person's on medical hold now, we need pending further information that we're going to get, and then we would refer that person out to either a psychologist, a psychiatrist. It might mean that we refer them out to a behavioral specialist, and then other additional information is going to be gathered, and then that person would report that information back to the medical doctor to then make a determination. Does that make sense? That's again where you'd want your policy and procedure to be outlined. I'm going to tell you right now, if you have to send someone for a medical evaluation and then a psychological evaluation in this valley, they could be 3 weeks out. And if you put that person on medical hold, that means they're pending those results. You're not going to have them working. The other part might be is that you need a functional evaluation though. So then the doctor would write and say, okay, we've done the physical, we've identified this person's medical limitations, but I don't know enough to know whether they can meet all these criteria for the job under the job description. So therefore, I'm going to request a functional eval. And then that's when they come and see us for lifting, carrying, pushing, pulling, reaching, climbing. All those identifiable factors that have to do with a person's physical and functional performance. And then more than that, what you can do with certain people who are looking at a fit for duty is you can do job-specific task performance. And this can either be done in the clinic setting, where we replicate it in the clinic, or in certain cases, we've had it be where we'll go out on the job site. We'll meet the employer will schedule time with us, and we'll go out and observe the person in their own environment performing those tasks to get to the bottom of whether or not they can do that. Oftentimes that has to do, on-site work tasks has to do with endurance. We want to see, can the person not only do it once, but can they do it over time? So that's how, and then once we get all those results, we report our feedback back to the provider. The provider then outlines whether the person's medically capable and whether they're functionally capable and whether they're psychologically capable to return to work. Kind of general and broad, but does that kind of give you a view? Okay. Any questions? God, I wish I had 2 hours.
Whether or not they can do that over a long period of time.
So in the world of occupational health, some of the things that you can do is you can break tasks down into time frames, and you can make, there's different kind of equations that we use that look at how if a person does an activity for 1 to 6 minutes at a time, that's considered rare. If they do it up to 30 to 60 times in an hour, then we consider that occasional. If they do it over 120 times in a given hour, an activity, a specific task, we consider that frequent. And if they do it more than 120 times and do it for up to an hour, we consider that constant. So there's these different categories that we'll do, and we have to project. Or we would say, Grover, there's no way for us to determine this person's endurance unless we spend 4 hours here. Do we want to approve to have us come out here for 4 hours and watch this guy? We can break it down like that, but that can get kind of costly. So we'll end up projecting. So, and that goes in, you've heard that before, rare, occasional, frequent, and constant. So that's where it kind of comes out of. And you can usually tell if I can get someone to do 10 squats in under 2 minutes, then that's going to be considered an occasional frequency. If they only can do 2 squats in 2 minutes, then I'm starting to ask the question of whether or not they would have the ability to perform that activity over time. And sometimes in our testing, we test for about 2 hours. we might address squatting in the beginning, and then about an hour later address squatting again and see if there's been a change in their function.
Hey, Jared, can you go over the frequency, the rare, the occasional, what those numbers were again?
Yeah. Okay. So 1 to 6% of an hour, or 1 to 6 minutes in an hour, is identified as rare. That's a rare task. Anything above 6 and less than 20 is considered occasional. Once you hit 21 up to 60, I think it is considered frequent. And then anything 60 to like 120 is considered constant. So, and you're looking at percentage of a day too. So if you do kind of break that down. If you want to, I'll send you a little grid. I'll put that in the grid when I'll put it in the PowerPoint so you can kind of see that. That's the language you want to see. That this is going to, hopefully this makes sense, but under the Oregon rules, the workers' comp, so if we call this the workers' comp table again, the workers' comp definitions have to align with the fitness for duty definitions so that they are comparable to when you're defining the job. So if I define a job at a rare occasion, it has to equal what's happening in the fit for duty and in the workers' comp rules too, so that everyone's speaking the same language. What often happens though is usually an HR person gets a hold of the job description and says, oh, okay, I'm going to go out on the floor today, and it looks like they do that occasionally. They'll write down occasionally. But in reality, we don't know if it's occasional unless we measure it. And what's one person's definition of occasional might not be the same definition of occasional for someone else. So when I ask how many cups of coffee, how often does he drink coffee in the course of the workday, and he says, well, just occasionally. Does that mean 1 cup of coffee every hour?
I consider it.
Yeah. So that would be occasional in my world. So does that answer your question? Okay. We're running up against I wanted to get to this stuff. So I've kind of presented, and again, there is so much more to this, and so I hope this is just a really basic overview. We could probably talk for a couple more hours on this. In fact, I got asked to speak at a conference up in Alaska, I guess, the safety conference that's up in Alaska. And we're preparing, it's a 3-hour presentation on Fit for Duty. So you guys are getting just like the frosting. We're not getting into the cake yet. So I did want to create some scenarios, and I thought it was funny. I didn't write these. I had the person that works with me write these. So I thought it was funny. A 4-hour functional test was performed by Jared Hill. That would be funny for me to talk about Jared Hill as if he was someone else. But case scenario number 1, just to give you an idea of what we are dealing with. A 61-year-old male surgeon presents for a fit for duty. He made the request for himself. Okay? The Oregon Board of Licensing questioned his ability to perform the essential functions of his job, and he needed to find someone that could say, I can do my job. So he called us in. He had a syncopal episode. Does everyone know what that mean? He fainted while he was doing a surgery. Okay? We provided a review of the testing, the EKG. So he went out and got all this different types of testing, the EKG, a EEG, a brain MRI, and a panel of labs, and then presented those to us and said, I need you to evaluate to determine so I can tell the Oregon Board of Licensing that I'm free and clear. We didn't find anything in the medical evaluation that would suggest that he had an underlying medical condition. We just simply said that he probably got hot while he was doing a surgery and he fainted. I'm glad he wasn't my surgeon when he did that. There was no recommendation from the neurologist on this. And then I went in and actually suited up. I went in and watched 2 surgeries that he did. It was fantastic. He did a great job. I learned quite a few things watching it. We did 4 hours of observation. I identified no difficulties or any restrictions in anything that he did. And so I went back and said to the medical doctor, I would see him as physically capable to perform all the essential functions of his job. And then the doctor reviewed all of this, went over it with him, and then we identified that there were no work restrictions, no concerns, and we cleared him that he was fit for duty. Send all that information off, and he was cleared to go back to work. So that's scenario 1. Another case. 40-year-old female presents for a fit for duty, and this time it was at the request of the employer. So remember, our first scenario was the request of the individual. She had 30 minutes of syncopal episode. Syncope seems to be the question. Everyone's going to know what syncope is now. And had to be aroused by the employer. She was falling asleep at work, literally. They'd go into her office and she'd be asleep on her desk. Seen at the ED and declared to have a supraventricular tachycardia. Does anyone know what that is? She had a arrhythmia of her heart. It caused her to faint. She didn't know it was coming on, but when it came on, she'd pass out. She hadn't reported any episodes in 2 months, so the request was by the employer for a fit for duty. We performed a records review. In this case, what am I going to study functionally about her? You know, sit in her office and wait till she faints? So there was no need for the doctor to request for us to go back in and do a functional evaluation. So we identified she was capable to perform the job, but then there was the caveat that was placed on that if she had another episode, the doctor reported it would be advised that she be placed off of work until the problem could be resolved. Okay. Yes?
So this kind of brings up the question that relates back to the surgeon. So the task-oriented piece of it is what you were doing while you were observing him during his 4 hours.
Mm-hmm.
But if your company's policy was, and I don't know if it is or not, but it was to put them on either paid administrative leave or leave until the issue is resolved or until they figure out what to do with it, how can they legally do some sort of work, whether it's in this case was surgery, if you put them on that leave?
Well, in the surgeon's perspective, he's his own employer, so he gets to call his own shots.
But even if it's a case, you know, where it's not a surgeon, it's something else. If you're bringing them back to perform those duties at that workplace, how does that fit together?
Yeah, that has to be approved. Sometimes it can be done in the course. Like I've gone into a work environment where we did the evaluation, but it was never in the live scenario, in the live scene. You know, we didn't put them on. Maybe it was when they shut the plant down, and then we met earlier in the shift, and he said, "These are the activities I do." Or it was a situation like the one in this case where the person was allowed to continue to work because they hadn't had any episodes. But if they were to have another episode, they would pull them off of work. So, yeah.
Wouldn't you be able to base it upon the performance of other workers performing the same tasks or duties? Like just to see what types of functions?
If you're looking at that's where you would use both the clinical setting and the on-site setting. The on-site setting would mean I'd go out with, let's say, Tanya, you would identify 3 people that I would go observe. This is the normal way that you do this job. And then we would replicate in the clinic setting that similar activity and then look at endurance, functional performance, capacities. So that's where you'd use the 2 together. Yeah. Okay, any other thoughts on this? Okay. So rest of the story, went back to work for 2 weeks. Guess what? Had another episode, was taken back off of work, and then decided that she was no longer capable to do that kind of work, and she ended up retiring from her position. So it could have ended a lot different. And that's one thing I think that I want to make sure that I'm introducing to this group is the Fit for Duty is a tool and a resource for you as an employer, as a safety professional, to 1, keep the employees safe at work, but then 2, drive that train when it comes to how do we effectively help this person be able to be successful in their job or make and determine decisions on what the next step in their career needs to be. Okay, scenario 3. 50-year-old male referred for a fit for duty by the employer that he was losing his balance while lifting more than 20 pounds. Also, this person worked in lifting and carrying patients, and so they were having difficulty when other people were working with them. The other people were saying, this person's not carrying their weight. The evaluation, we identified 1, extremely deconditioned, physically weak, and it was for a very high physical demanding job. We sent him off for a physical capacity, PCE2. A physical capacity evaluation is an evaluation where you're looking at the person's total functional capacity. You're looking at lifting, carrying, pushing, pulling, reaching, climbing, balance. You're looking at whether or not they have endurance issues with their standing, walking, and sitting. You're also looking at gripping and grasping, pinching, pulling. And so we put all those together. It's a very specific form, and we evaluated everything that person could do. It's like a 2-hour evaluation. We then tested their tolerance, and we identified that they fall within what's called the medium physical demand. The medium physical demand means that they can lift up to 50 pounds. But just because you can lift up to 50 pounds once, does that mean you can meet the essential functions of your job? No. What we then did is we looked at endurance. So we had them lift over time, a multiple of times, and determined that they were unable to sustain the repetitive physical lifting or carrying above 50 pounds. Guess what the descriptive job description said? In order to do this job, you have to be able to lift up to 75 pounds individually on an occasional frequency. So we identified the person couldn't lift occasionally up to 75 pounds, and we reported that back to the provider. And then not soon after, the employee was reassigned and kept working for the company, but in a less physically demanding job. All right. Starting to see the eyes go, so we're almost done. I got about a couple more minutes. Okay, case scenario. This one's interesting. 64-year-old male, fit for duty, observed by coworkers to have varying medical issues. He had not only been observed with medical issues, but he'd also reported medical issues to his coworkers. Coworkers got worried about him. Like, not worried about him and being able to do the job, worried about him that he was going to die. They were concerned about his overall physical health and reported it to the employer. Employer began to observe him. They brought it to the employer's attention, and they took him off of work and then said, we want you to go get seen for your evaluation. Did not have any current symptoms that he reported to us, and we identified that all his medical conditions were stable. He was deemed to have no work restrictions. He was able to do everything that we identified. But then the doctor said, let's test him functionally and see how he does. We tested him functionally and did a physical capacity evaluation. And the PCE was requested to get definitive answers on whether he can meet the physical job demands. He had the characteristic of medium heavy. Medium heavy means he could lift occasionally between 50 and 75 pounds. He was physically fit. And we identified that he was able to perform all the essential functions of his job. They provided a really good job description from the employer. So we established, okay, he can do all the physical. So we sent him back to work and said, he's fit for duty. Guess what we found out later? The employees didn't much care for the guy. They didn't like him. They didn't want him on the team. They singled him out to try and get him out of there. Interesting. Other thing, though, that we did catch, though, is he became concerned enough about his physical condition that he went and saw his primary care physician. He got on high blood pressure medication, and he lost like 20 pounds. So he says the best thing that ever could have happened. So, okay, I think I've got one more. Nope, I don't. And that puts us right at about 1 o'clock. So I guess what I would say to this group is recognize that the Fit for Duty is a tool and resource for safety and health professionals to be able to identify what a person's capacity is to be successful and safe in the job that they're doing. It's not a way to terminate an employee because you don't like them or because you don't think they're pulling their own weight. But it can be a resource for you to make decisions in how you're going to accommodate somebody, how you're going to help someone to be more successful in their job, and how you're going to ultimately help someone identify something that maybe they haven't identified or want to identify, and that is their ability or inability to perform the essential functions of their job. Any questions? That seemed very quick to me. It seemed like we got through quite a bit of stuff. I hope that if you do have any other questions, I will send out an electronic copy of this to Pam so that she can send it out. You've got my cell phone number there. If you need to email me, you can call me at my regular line. And then if you are interested in questions about Fit for Duty, and you maybe need us to address something that you're maybe grappling with in the workforce, we're seeing more and more. Fit for Duty about 10 years ago was almost non-existent. We didn't really see a lot of them. They came usually at the request of very extreme cases. More and more, I just got a phone call yesterday on my drive home. Someone said, I met with an employee yesterday. He broke down and told me he just doesn't think he can do his job anymore. Is there something we can do to help identify what he can do? So we're going to schedule a Fit for Duty. If you use this as a resource and a tool to help employees, it can be a great way to not only help you make decisions for the person in the job, but sometimes literally it's to help an individual make a decision that I'm just not cut out for this anymore. And before they get injured doing that, because they either become apathetic or unable, you're protecting them, and then they're able to make a decision with the support of not the employer, but a third party that can help make that decision. So thank you.